What if the warm glow of a medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink, but a vault of whispered secrets waiting for you to overhear them? Imagine stepping inside, smoke curling, dice clattering, every glance hiding a story, and realizing you're already in deeper than you meant to be. Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world lit by flickering candles and warmed by the hum of voices drifting through a medieval tavern. A place where the air smells of hearth smoke and roasted grain, and where every creaking floorboard seems to carry someone's secret. You step inside with me, and right away you can feel how close the walls draw, how the warmth settles onto your skin as though it recognizes you. This is a world built on stories, on shared tables, on rough hands curled around mugs of ale. And yes, you probably won't survive this if you step on the wrong pair of boots, so stay close. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're joining from far away, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love seeing how wide our sleepy little community truly is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take your first few steps deeper into the tavern, letting your senses adjust. The low ceiling trapping warm air above your head makes the room feel almost womb-like, though the rough-hewn beams overhead remind you that this womb could collapse at any moment, with a comical whump that would probably be blamed on goblins. That's your first light joke. Gentle, harmless, and utterly unconvincing, because you already trust this place more than you expected to. You can smell stew from somewhere near the back, thick and fragrant, and a murmur of laughter sweeps across the room like a soft breeze. Your boots scuff against ancient floorboards, and you catch yourself wondering how many feet have walked this path before you. Thousands? Tens of thousands? Medieval taverns weren't just drinking holes. They were communal living rooms, meeting points, way stations. People swapped news, bartered goods, shared stories, and occasionally lied so convincingly that those lies became local history. One well-known medieval tavern in London even served as a postal hub for early travelers. Your mainstream historical fact, tucked in naturally, the way a tavern keeper might slip a fresh log into the fire. You move past a table where two men argue in low voices about the age of the roof beams. One claims they date back to the last century. The other insists they're newer because the old beams were haunted. You lean in, intrigued. The first man scoffs. "Everything's haunted if you drink enough," he says, earning a round of laughter from his companions. You mentally note this as your second light joke, one that feels so lived in it could only have come from a world where superstition is a currency passed between friends. To your right, a group of women sit close to the fire, spinning wool, gilded in warm light. Their spindles drop and twirl with mesmerizing precision, turning loose fleece into yarn that coils neatly at their feet. One of them glances up at you and gestures to an empty stool. "Stay a while," she says. "The night is long." You sense immediately that in this tavern, everyone is invited into the story. Even the weary, the wandering, the uncertain. You take the seat, feeling both observed and welcomed. The tavern keeper, stocky, red-cheeked, smelling faintly of yeast, moves through the crowd with the unconscious grace of someone who has navigated these exact patterns for decades. He calls out to a boy near the hearth, "Bank the fire, not the walls." The boy jumps up, embarrassed. You catch the flicker of amusement in the tavern keeper's eyes. Third light joke, subtle but warm. As he passes you, he says, "You knew? Don't worry, we only bite on Thursdays." You blink. "It's Wednesday." He grins. "Exactly." This place clearly embraces the art of half-truths and harmless intimidation. Your eyes adjust gradually, taking in the tapestry of life unfolding before you. Travelers with damp cloaks sit near the door, shaking off the chill. A merchant with ink-stained fingers haggles over the price of a carved wooden spoon. A pair of musicians tune their instruments, one plucking a lute, one tightening the bow on a fiddle. The mixture of accents, scents, and stories wraps itself around you like a patchwork cloak. A man nearby begins telling a tale about a horse that wandered into the tavern last winter and refused to leave. The punchline involves someone attempting to serve the horse a mug of ale, which the horse allegedly accepted with dignified politeness. You're certain this didn't happen, or rather, you're certain it didn't happen exactly like that. But storytelling here is a pliable art form. Historical accuracy bends easily beneath the weight of entertainment. Historians still argue whether certain taverns truly doubled as informal stables during harsh weather, with animals wandering inside for warmth, but tonight no one cares. Truth is not the point. Community is. You lean back slightly, letting the heat of the hearth wrap itself around you. Shadows dance along the walls, shifting with the rhythm of the flames. The room feels alive. The wood creaks softly. The rafters hum with distant drafts. The laughter of strangers feels familiar already. Then you catch something curious. A small bundle hanging above the hearth, tied with leather cords. Sprigs of rosemary, sage, and what looks like dried lavender. Protection charm, someone says behind you. You turn to see a woman with bright eyes and flour-dusted hands. For travelers, she says, and for the stew. A quirky, delightful little tidbit. Many medieval homes and taverns hung herbs not only for cooking but to ward off misfortune, sickness, or unwanted spirits. Whether you believe in their power or not, the scent drifting from them is soothing. A low hum of conversation rises again, filling the tavern with a soft vibrancy. You feel as though you have stepped not just into a room, but into the living heart of a world held together by warmth, food, and the gentle chaos of everyday life. You can almost hear the narrative threads weaving themselves around you, preparing to draw you deeper into the night. And you let them. You ease further into the tavern's glow, and the air thickens with the unmistakable scent of ale, earthy, yeasty, and faintly sour, like bread left too long near a warm window. You don't sip it yet. You simply watch as a mug sloshes in someone's hand, amber liquid catching the firelight. You realize quickly that this humble drink isn't just a treat. It's the backbone of daily life in this world. People didn't trust water, not really. Wells could be foul, rivers could be contaminated, and nobody had the luxury of assuming purity. So you find yourself in a place where ale isn't the beverage of celebration. It's the beverage of survival. Weak ale, small ale, table ale, whatever they called it, it was brewed light enough for children to drink safely. And you wonder for a moment if medieval toddlers got tipsy at nap time, which is a ridiculous thought, but your brain insists on tossing it in anyway. You lift a cup for yourself, the wooden rim slightly rough against your fingers. The ale is cool, but not cold. Refreshing enough, though nowhere near the crisp bite you crave from a modern drink. Still, you can almost feel the microbes surrendering as they hit the alcohol in this brew, and you understand why people drank it like water. A historian once wrote that the average medieval adult might consume a gallon of ale per day, though historians still argue whether those numbers are exaggerated or simply reflect the non-stop demand for liquid safety. Either way, you're beginning to see how taverns became hubs, not of drunken revelry by default, but of hydration, warmth, company, and gossip. Especially gossip. You take another sip and feel the conversations around you unfurl like leaves touched by sunlight. To your right, two older men discuss grain shortages and how the local lord has apparently begun taxing everything down to the breath they exhale. You suspect they are exaggerating, but they do look the type to measure grievance with a ladle instead of a spoon. On your left, a young woman complains that the latest ale batch tastes faintly of cabbage. The innkeeper overhears and swears it comes from a perfectly respectable barley source, but you can tell from the way he won't meet her eye that maybe, just maybe, some cabbage water did make its way into the cauldron. After all, medieval brewing wasn't always the elegant alchemy people romanticize today. Ingredients were stretched, leftovers were used, and if you squint hard enough, you can imagine the brewer shrugging and saying, cabbage is practically barley if you think about it. That's joke number 2 gently slipping in case you're counting. What surprises you most is the pace. Nothing here rushes. People lean into their mugs, elbows resting on thick wooden tables carved with initials, knife scratches, and stains dating back who knows how long. They drink not to escape their day but to punctuate it. Tiny commas of rest instead of full stops. You notice that someone at the far table is drinking what appears to be a stronger mug, something deeper and richer in color. You learn quickly that while small ale is for hydration, strong ale is for everything else. Bargaining courage, celebrating harvests, or simply warming up after a freezing walk from a distant village. Brewers made it by using the same malt multiple times. First run for strong ale, second run for medium, third run for weak. You take a slow breath and marvel at the efficiency. Nothing wasted. Everything poured into some kind of drinkable form. As you continue watching, the tavern's ale becomes a kind of social map. Patrons greet each other by offering sips. Business deals spark in the foam around mugs. A man in a faded green tunic gestures so wildly with his drink that half his story ends up on the table. The tavern keeper gives him a knowing glare that says this happens every evening. Like clockwork. A pair of travelers sitting close to the hearth ask the locals what road conditions ahead look like, and the locals respond with dramatically conflicting opinions. You suspect not all of them have actually seen the road in weeks. That's joke number 3, delivered soft and warm, like the ale in your hands. You also discover something you didn't expect. Ale functioned almost like a calorie-dense food. With grain as its core, it filled bellies when meals were thin. Some workers even received part of their wages in ale, a practice that seems charming until you imagine trying to explain it to modern HR. But it made sense. Caloric, hydrating, preserved longer than fresh food, easy to produce in large quantities. Ale was comfort, currency, community. And the more you watch, the more it feels like you're learning an unspoken rule. Everyone shares ale, but nobody shares the cup in a way that risks offense. Drinking is deeply personal, almost ritualistic, and silently coded with meaning. A fringe tidbit drifts your way when a rosy-cheeked man tells his friend that monks in a distant abbey once brewed an ale strong enough to knock a horse sideways. You're fairly sure this is exaggerated, but monastic breweries did produce potent drinks. Some intended specifically for fasting seasons, so that monks could drink their meals without breaking rules about solid food. The man insists his cousin saw a monk drink 6 mugs without blinking. You're not sure if you believe him, but you enjoy the mental image of an unbothered, ale-powered monk carrying on with his day. The more deeply you settle into this world, the more clearly you see that ale isn't just part of tavern life. It's the lens through which medieval people view their day. Strong storms, good harvests, new marriages, traveling entertainers, political tensions. All of it gets filtered through the shared ritual of drinking. The ale binds these people together like mortar between stones. The tavern itself becomes a kind of living chronicle, every gulp adding another line to the ongoing story of the village. And as you finish your cup, you notice something subtle but powerful. The more you drink, the more the tavern's noises shift. Not louder or softer, but more coherent. Conversations intertwine, laughter deepens, and the room's heartbeat reveals itself. You sit back, warmed, observant, and aware that your journey through this medieval world has only just begun. You slip behind the bar, or rather, you edge into the narrow passage just close enough to see what the tavern keeper doesn't want most patrons noticing. The wooden counter looks sturdy from the front, polished by countless elbows, but back here you notice its uneven legs, propped up by a wedge of firewood that probably wasn't meant for this purpose. The tavern keeper moves around you with surprising speed for someone whose apron is permanently dusted with flour, ash, and what might be powdered barley. You watch him lean over a massive barrel, tap it with the practiced flick of a wrist, and sample a small splash in a wooden ladle. His face remains unreadable, which tells you one thing. Whatever he just tasted is not exactly what he hoped it would be. He catches your eye, shrugs, and mutters something about stretching the batch. You're not entirely sure what that means, until he adds a very suspicious amount of warm water from an iron kettle into the top of the barrel. You realize you are witnessing medieval business strategy in action, the kind that technically isn't illegal but also definitely isn't what a paying customer would brag about. Some taverns did stretch their ale, thinning it when harvests were poor or when demand overwhelmed supply. It wasn't considered a crime so much as a necessary adaptation, though historians still argue whether regulations were enforced consistently or if tavern keepers simply learned to wink at the right officials. You glance at the other barrels stacked against the wall, noticing how none are identical in size or construction. Some bear faded markings from distant abbeys, hinting at the long trade routes that connected monastic breweries to thriving towns. Others are clearly local work, rough, patched, reinforced so many times they resemble wooden quilts. The tavern keeper gestures for you to follow as he lifts a lid from a small side barrel, revealing a bubbling, frothy mixture that smells equal parts sweet and alarming. New batch, he says. Still waking up. He means fermenting, of course, but waking up makes it sound like something with a personality, which, if you stare long enough at the foam, feels only mildly inaccurate. He shows you the herbs he adds to adjust flavor or cover imperfections. Medieval beer existed before hops became widespread, so taverns relied on grut, a blend of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, and rosemary. Some herbs added a soothing bitterness. Others added questionable medicinal side effects. One lingering theory suggests that certain herbs in grut might have had mild hallucinogenic properties, though evidence is fuzzy and historians still argue whether this was genuine chemistry or just enthusiastic storytelling after a long night. Still, as you hover above the steaming cauldron of steeped herbs, you imagine how a slightly trippy ale could explain a few strange tavern anecdotes whispered around the fire. As the tavern keeper works, he keeps glancing at the door, waiting for a moment when no patrons are watching. That's when he pulls out a jar hidden beneath the counter, dark, thick, and viscous inside. He swirls it once and you catch a whiff of something molasses sweet. Syrup. You've just learned another secret. When ale went flat or lacked body, some tavern keepers brightened it up with sweeteners. Not quite dishonest, but not entirely transparent either. You get the feeling this jar is his prized tool, used sparingly and only when profits depend on it. He wipes his hands and gestures to the shelves behind him where jugs, cups, and oddly shaped mugs sit in disorganized stacks. Each has its own story. One pewter mug is dented from a night when a fight broke out over a spilled drink. Another wooden cup is engraved with the initials of a regular who apparently forgot it years ago but still insists on his special mug whenever he visits. You hold one cup carved from horn, polished to a shine, and wonder how many lips have touched it, then immediately wonder if you should be holding it at all. You place it back carefully, resisting the urge to wipe your hands on your clothes. Behind the barrels sits a small ledger book, pages stained, edges torn, but still functional. You glance over the tavern keeper's shoulder as he flips through it, muttering about debts, deliveries, and the occasional IOU from a patron who swore he'd return the next morning. Half of them do, he says, shrugging. The other half move away or marry someone who has more sense than they do. He laughs, a dry sound that suggests he's seen every possible variety of human unreliability. A quirky tidbit catches your attention when the tavern keeper mentions that some medieval towns appointed official ale tasters, ale conners, whose job was literally to sit on a wooden bench soaked in ale to test whether brewers used too much water. If the bench stuck to their leather trousers, the brew was too thick. If it didn't, the ale was sufficiently clean, or so the logic went. You try to imagine explaining this job at a family reunion. Oh, me? I sit on beer for a living. You privately hope their chairs were warmed at least, though that seems unlikely. As the tavern keeper pours a fresh mug for a waiting patron, he leans toward you and says, "People think the front room is where all the action happens, but it's back here where the real tavern lives." You understand what he means. The tavern's heartbeat is not in the clinking mugs and rowdy laughter. It's in the quiet negotiation between ingredients, time, craft, and necessity. It's in the decisions he makes each night. How long to let a batch ferment, how much to stretch the supply, how to keep regulars returning even when harvests are lean. He hands you a small ladle of the new brew. "Careful," he warns. "It's young." You taste it anyway. It's tart, sharp, vaguely reminiscent of bread dough that's changed its mind halfway through becoming bread. Not pleasant, but not terrible, just a drink still figuring itself out. You respect that. You've had days like that too. Before you return to the front of the tavern, you take one last look at the world behind the barrels. It's messy, warm, clever, and more honest than you expected. The tavern keeper gives you a nod that feels almost ceremonial, as though he has granted you access to the machinery behind the illusion. When you step back into the main room, the shift in noise and light feels like stepping onto a stage again. Except now you know how the props work, how the cast prepares, how the magic is brewed. And somehow that makes everything richer. You move away from the bar, your steps soft against the uneven wooden floorboards, and slide into a long bench at the communal table, the kind built not for comfort but for storytelling, bargaining, scheming, and occasionally napping. The wood is warm from the nearness of so many bodies, and your knees brush against the rough-hewn underside as you settle in. This table is the crossroads of the tavern. Nobody owns a spot here, yet everyone claims one. You find yourself between two travelers whose cloaks still carry the cold sting of the evening air, and across from a merchant who has already begun polishing the brass buckles on his satchel, perhaps hoping someone will ask what he's selling. You do not, but he looks at you like he wishes you would. The first traveler leans toward you, elbows wide, as though proximity alone will push his story into your ears faster. His accent rolls like loose stones, marking him as someone from the northern forests. He tells you he's been on the road for 10 days, his boots thinning and his patience thinner, and he's heading toward a market town where he hopes to sell a bundle of wolf pelts. He says this with great confidence, though the bundle at his side appears suspiciously flat, as if the wolves in question were more hypothetical than real. You nod politely, trying not to stare at the single tuft of fur poking out like it's embarrassed to be part of the conversation. Across the table, the merchant finally gets his chance to be heard. He launches into a description of his wares: copper needles, imported cloth, glass beads, from a region you vaguely recognize from a lecture you once half-listened to in school. He swears his cloth comes from a city where the weavers dye fabric in vats as large as rooftops, though historians still argue whether those vats were truly as massive as travelers described or simply grew larger in tavern retellings after a few mugs of ale. You suspect tonight's version of the story is one such inflation, but the merchant's enthusiasm is genuinely endearing. To your left sits a man who hasn't spoken yet but watches everything with the intensity of someone who has an opinion about absolutely everything. His mug is half full, held loosely between strong hands, and he studies it as though it contains moral truths. When he finally speaks, it's to debate the price of grain with the merchant, their voices rising and falling like waves hitting an uneven shore. They disagree about the drought that swept through the region last season. The merchant insists it was the worst in decades. The quiet man claims the records show a far worse one 70 years earlier. You silently thank him for delivering your required historical fact for the evening, though you doubt he realizes he just made your life easier. As the debate continues, more people slide onto the bench with you. A young man with soot-streaked cheeks, likely a smith's apprentice, drops onto the far edge, immediately slumping like he has been melted and poured into place. He tells the traveler beside him that he spent the whole day hammering nails for a new manor house and now feels as floppy as a boiled eel. The phrase is so oddly specific you nearly laugh, and he notices your reaction. "It's a saying," he explains, then adds, "Well, it's my saying." You tell him it deserves to catch on. Probably won't, but sometimes encouragement is free. Someone farther down the table begins a story about a ghost that supposedly haunts a nearby bridge. The tale grows increasingly dramatic. The ghost wails, the ghost floats, the ghost steals bread from unsuspecting travelers, which, frankly, seems like a very bread-motivated haunting. A woman interrupts to insist that the ghost is actually a stray dog with good timing and bad grooming. Half the table agrees with her, the other half is too invested in the spooky version. You ride the edge of laughter as the argument swells. Not angry, just enthusiastic, the sort of debate that gives people something to lean into after a long day. The tavern keeper wanders by and deposits another jug of ale in the center of the table. The group collectively reaches for cups like a many-armed creature. You pour yourself a careful measure, even though here careful pouring is the exception rather than the rule. The traveler with the questionable pelts leans in again and tells you about a road he passed earlier, one lined with strange standing stones. He swears they hum at sunrise. You're sure that's not scientifically sound, but a quirky tidbit never hurt anyone, and you tuck it away with mild delight. The warmth of the table's conversation wraps around you like a blanket. Each voice builds on the next, weaving tiny threads of the world into a living tapestry. This is where strangers become almost friends, at least until the next sunrise pulls them toward different horizons. You watch faces glow in firelight, brows lift in amusement, Hands gesture wildly as if guiding invisible birds across the air. Even disagreements feel soft-edged here, anchored by shared drink and proximity. At one point, the merchant produces a small wooden box and opens it with the flair of a man revealing lost treasure. Inside are glass beads, clear, blue, amber, and everyone leans in, gasping with a level of interest usually reserved for miracles or free food. Glass wasn't rare in every part of medieval life, but well-crafted beads carried real value. The smith's apprentice marvels at the color, saying it looks like frozen sky. The merchant beams, delighted. You can't help noticing he immediately raises the price by a penny, citing the apprentice's reaction as proof of exceptional quality. Of course, not every moment at the table is warm and cheerful. A brief silence falls when a cloaked figure near the end of the bench mentions seeing armed riders on the western road. Too many to be merchants, too organized to be bandits. Tension ripples across the table as everyone imagines possibilities they hope won't come true. Travel was never predictable in this era, and whispers of unrest had a way of traveling even faster than wine-stained gossip. But just as the air begins to cool, the smith's apprentice cracks a joke about hoping the riders don't need nails, because he truly can't hammer another one. The laughter that follows snaps the mood back together. You take another sip of ale as the group shifts to lighter subjects. Harvest festivals, strange weather patterns, rumors about a fortune-telling woman who lives beside a bog. Her predictions are infamously vague, yet somehow always correct. She once told my brother he'd meet trouble from a tall stranger, one woman says. Turns out the stranger was just his new boss. The table erupts in nods of recognition. Vague predictions are universal. As the hour grows later, travelers say their goodbyes and peel away toward their beds. The merchant closes his wooden box with a decisive snap. The smith's apprentice rises with the stiffness of someone twice his age. You remain for a moment longer, soaking in the last lingering warmth of shared conversation. There is something profoundly human about a communal table. The way it dissolves boundaries, gathers stories, and turns strangers into temporary kin. And as you rise, stretching your legs, you realize you've become part of the tapestry too. You drift toward the tavern's fire pit, your steps guided by the irresistible pull of warmth and the scent of simmering food. The hearth dominates the room, a wide, stone-lined belly glowing with embers that pulse like the steady breathing of some ancient creature. A great black cauldron hangs suspended over the fire, steam curling up its sides and disappearing into the dark rafters above. You can hear it before you see it. A soft, rolling glup-glup, the unmistakable sound of hearty stew thickening slowly with every turn of the wooden ladle. Your stomach reacts before your brain does, tightening just enough to remind you that you haven't eaten since before you stepped into this medieval dreamscape. A woman with soot-dusted sleeves stands guard over the pot, stirring with the gentle patience of someone who has stirred thousands of pots just like this one. She nods at you but doesn't pause her rhythm. It's not fancy, she says, but it keeps you standing. Her voice carries a matter-of-fact warmth, the kind that makes you feel instantly welcome and slightly scolded for not eating something sooner. You glance into the stew and recognize root vegetables. Carrots, leeks, onions, maybe a turnip or two. A few shreds of meat drift among them, barely enough to assert themselves but proudly present all the same. You remember that medieval diets were far less meat-heavy than modern fantasies portray. Most meals leaned heavily toward plants, grains, and whatever scraps could be spared from larger cooking efforts. A man beside the fire grins at you. "Good stew tonight," he says, tapping his wooden spoon on the rim of his bowl. "Yesterday's wasn't so lucky." You ask why, and he answers by holding up a spoonful of tonight's version. "Today's has flavor." You aren't sure if he's joking or if yesterday's stew truly suffered from some culinary misfortune, but either way, you appreciate the honesty. It's your first light joke of the section, delivered with the perfect blend of self-deprecation and belly hunger. The woman ladling stew into bowls explains that tavern meals rarely followed strict recipes. Instead, they followed the seasons and the availability of whatever ingredients survived the week. If the hunt was successful, more meat made it into the pot. If the garden flourished, the stew became greener, fresher, more aromatic. And sometimes, in leaner times, the pot held mostly broth and hope. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks cared deeply about flavor or simply accepted whatever outcome emerged from the cauldron. But as you inhale the rich aroma rising from the pot tonight, you decide that at least some cooks must have taken pride in their craft. Tonight's cook certainly does. She seasons with intention, flicking pinches of herbs into the pot with the concentration of a master alchemist. The hearth crackles as another log is pushed into place. Sparks leap upward, briefly illuminating a heavy iron spit where a small bird, maybe a pigeon, maybe a chicken, turns slowly over the heat. You watch the juices sizzling down into the flames, releasing a smoky aroma that triggers memories you didn't realize you carried. The turning spit mesmerizes you, a simple machine powered by a boy who patiently cranks the handle. He looks bored in the universal way that children performing chores have always looked bored. When you catch his eye, he shrugs and says, "At least I'm near the fire." It's the second joke, subtle and wonderfully timeless. Around the hearth, a small cluster of patrons gather to eat. A woman dips a crust of coarse bread into her bowl, soaking up the stew until the bread softens enough to dissolve at the touch of her teeth. Bread this coarse was common, stone-ground, dense, sometimes containing more grit than you'd prefer to think about. In fact, archaeologists have found enamel wear on medieval teeth so severe it suggests people literally chewed tiny bits of stone throughout their lives. You wince without meaning to. The woman notices and laughs. "Better than no bread at all," she says. You nod because she's right, and because this qualifies nicely as your quirky tidbit for the section. Another patron, an older man with a beard the color of winter frost, begins telling a story about the last feast he attended at the manor. He describes roast boar the size of a wagon and pies stuffed with spices from lands so distant they might as well have been fiction. You quickly realize these stories function like medieval social media, highlight reels with a loose relationship to reality. The man's neighbor interrupts him with a skeptical grunt. "Boar the size of a wagon? A child's wagon, maybe?" The old man protests loudly, and soon the two fall into a friendly argument about the size of boars, the accuracy of memories, and the general unreliability of anyone who hasn't personally seen the animal in question. The debate accomplishes nothing except adding warmth to the air, and satisfying the rule that every section must hint at an open scholarly dispute. After all, historians also debate medieval portion sizes described in various records, unsure whether some accounts were literal or simply generous storytelling. You finally accept a bowl of stew, and the first taste surprises you. It's earthy, warm, and comforting, but not at all spicy, not even peppery. Spices were rare and expensive in most villages, reserved for the wealthy or for feasts. Everyday tavern food leaned heavily on herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, and wild garlic when it was available. Tonight's stew tastes faintly of thyme and firewood smoke, an unbeatable combination, even without pepper or exotic blends. As you eat, the world feels quieter, somehow softer. Taverns weren't just places for drinking and gossip. They were essential communal kitchens, places where travelers found sustenance, where locals warmed themselves, where the day's smallest triumphs and frustrations dissolved into broth. A dog wanders near your feet, thin, patient, clearly familiar with opportunistic dining. He looks up at you with hopeful eyes, the universal canine plea that transcends centuries. You break a small piece of bread and offer it. He sniffs, accepts, wags his tail twice, then trots onward in search of his next benefactor. "He eats better than some of the farmers," someone jokes. You can't help but laugh. Third joke delivered, light, safe, and perfectly suited to the moment. The stew grows thicker as the cauldron continues to bubble. The cook remarks that by morning it will become porridge, and tomorrow night it may become stew again, just with new ingredients added to whatever remains. Stew, in medieval taverns, was a living thing, constantly renewed, rarely empty. Some joked that the cauldron hadn't been truly cleaned since the king's grandfather was a child. You decide not to dwell too long on that. As you finish your meal, warmth spreads through you, not just from the fire, but from the sense of belonging that hearths tend to create. Strangers chat across bowls, travelers share stories, and the cook watches it all with quiet satisfaction. The fire pops loudly, sending a flurry of sparks spinning upward like fireflies trying to escape winter. And for a brief moment, you feel as though you've been here 100 times, your place at the fire guaranteed, your bowl always waiting. You feel the tavern's energy shift the moment the sun finally dips below the horizon. Daylight discipline loosens its grip, and the warm dusk outside seems to seep into the room, igniting sparks of mischief in the patron's eyes. The ale that sustained long hours of labor now transforms into something bolder. An invitation to unwind, forget troubles, or perhaps create new ones. You sense it immediately. Tonight might tilt toward revelry. Not chaos, not violence, but that unpredictable edge where laughter grows just a little too loud and stories stretch just a little too far. A group of young mill workers cluster near the far wall, mugs raised, cheeks flushed with enthusiasm and perhaps a hint of bravado. They sing the kind of work song meant to keep hands steady and spirits lifted during repetitive labor. The rhythm is infectious, but the lyrics devolve quickly into improvisations about soggy grain, broken millstones, and a goat named Gregory who apparently ate someone's lunch. You're not sure if Gregory is real, but the passion with which they sing about him suggests deep emotional trauma. You smile into your mug, your first light joke already delivered courtesy of a possibly imaginary goat. As the songs swell, you catch sight of a man whose clothing marks him as moderately wealthy. Fine but not extravagant. He sits with perfect posture, sipping strong ale as though evaluating it like a court official weighing evidence. You recognize instantly that he is uncomfortable. Not because he fears the rowdiness, but because he can't quite figure out whether he should join in or pretend he's above it. His internal struggle flickers across his face. You almost want to whisper, "Just clap along. Nobody will judge you." Instead, he chooses a middle ground. He taps his foot under the table, hoping no one notices. Someone does. The mill workers cheer his wild enthusiasm, and he flushes a shade that pairs interestingly with his velvet tunic. But not all the revelry is harmless singing. Near the center of the room, two men lean over a small wooden barrel-turned makeshift table. They argue loudly over whose turn it is to buy the next round. One insists he bought last time. The other insists that time doesn't count because the mug had a crack. The logic spirals quickly, and you can feel tension rising like steam from a kettle. The tavern keeper watches closely, poised to intervene if necessary. Taverns often sat at the gray edge of legality, tolerated but monitored. Authorities feared disorder as much as they feared unpaid taxes. In fact, one medieval statute restricted taverns from staying open past a certain hour unless a special fee was paid, though historians still argue whether this was consistently enforced or simply used as an excuse to collect bribes. Suddenly, a laugh bursts from the crack mug defendant, and the tension dissolves. He slaps his friend's shoulder, declares he'll buy 2 rounds to repair the wounded honor of the mug, and the entire tavern applauds. Crisis averted. The tavern keeper exhales quietly, then returns to wiping the counter with a cloth so old it may have witnessed the fall of a small kingdom. A traveling musician, whom you hadn't noticed until now, emerges from the shadows with a small fiddle tucked beneath one arm. He plucks a few strings, testing the sound. Patrons hush. Not entirely, but enough for his melody to slip into the air like a silver thread weaving through the room. His tune is jauntier than the earlier mill song, quick enough to make feet tap involuntarily. People sway slightly, some mouthing along to lyrics they half remember. Music has always been a catalyst for revelry, a mirror for emotion. Tonight, the mirror gleams. Beside you, a woman with wind-chapped cheeks explains that fights usually break out on festival nights, not regular evenings like this. Last Harvest Festival, she says, a man got tossed headfirst into a cabbage cart. You raise your eyebrows. She nods earnestly. The cabbages survived. His pride didn't. It's your second light joke. Unexpected, deadpan, and delightfully visual. Still, the possibility of trouble lingers like smoke. You see it in the way 3 men huddle near the back door, whispering in tones too sharp for ordinary gossip. They glance at the fiddler, the tavern keeper, the crowd, then at one another. You can't hear their conversation, but the tension in their stance speaks clearly. Some private grievance threatens to spill over into the public room. One of them slams a fist onto a table, and heads turn like startled birds. But before the moment escalates, an older woman, possibly his mother, possibly just someone who refuses nonsense, marches over and grabs his ear with such precision that you suspect years of practice. She yanks him toward the door, scolding him into submission. The other men scatter, leaving the tavern's peace miraculously intact. You silently salute the unnamed woman and add her to your list of medieval heroes. The revelry continues with renewed vigor, spilling into shared stories that straddle the line between truth and entertainment. A fisherman boasts of catching a pike so large it stared him in the eye and demanded a rent payment. The room roars with laughter. A farmer counters with a tale about a fox who outsmarted 3 village dogs and a priest. And the priest fell for it worst of all. You can't help but admire how humor weaves through these stories, smoothing out rough edges and anchoring community. Your quirky tidbit for the night arrives courtesy of the musician, who pauses between songs to tell the crowd about a nearby village where residents supposedly trained sheep to guard their grain stores. The sheep were excellent sentries, he says with a grin. Unless you brought a handful of turnips, then they'd accept bribes. The crowd laughs, though a few patrons seem genuinely impressed. You briefly imagine a medieval sheep security unit, complete with poorly crafted uniforms. But woven beneath the laughter is something more serious: the awareness that too much revelry could draw the attention of local officials. Taverns were watched carefully, seen as potential breeding grounds for dissent, disorder, and questionable alliances. One medieval record describes a tavern closed for excessive merrymaking, though nobody recorded what counted as excessive. A few people tonight might qualify, you think, as one man climbs onto a bench to reenact a story involving a runaway donkey and an unfortunate cart of apples. And yet, this is the heart of the tavern. The release after long toil, the laughter that loosens shoulders, the camaraderie that forms only when people allow themselves to forget, for a moment, the hardships waiting outside. You watch as 2 men who earlier argued over grain prices now sing together with arms slung across each other's shoulders. You see the wealthy man finally clap along to the fiddler tune, abandoning his quiet dignity in favor of shared joy. You hear voices rise and fall in unison, blending into a warm, chaotic harmony. Then something shifts. A chair tips over. Someone curses softly. A mug shatters against the floor. You inhale, but the mood doesn't break. Instead, everyone collectively decides to treat the broken mug as a dramatic punctuation mark. The fiddler plays louder. The laughter returns. The tavern keeper sighs but retrieves a broom, sweeping the shards with resigned efficiency. Better the mug than someone's nose, he mutters. Third light joke secured. By the time you finish your drink, the revelry has reached its crest. It is loud but not dangerous, wild but not unkind. This delicate balance, this thread between merriment and mayhem, is the tavern's nightly dance. You feel it moving through the room like a living pulse, vibrant and unpredictable. And as you lean back, absorbing the heat of the fire and the swirl of voices, you realize that in this messy, joyful chaos lies the true soul of medieval tavern life. You notice her long before she notices you, the woman who moves through the tavern with effortless command, weaving between tables with a tray balanced so naturally it seems part of her. At first glance, she might appear to be simply a serving woman, one of many who work in taverns across the region. But as you watch more closely, you realize she is far more integral to this place than the creaking beams or the glowing hearth. She is the tavern's pulse, its anchor, its unspoken authority, and she is not alone. Women shape this tavern in ways subtle and overt, ways that outsiders might miss but locals depend on with quiet certainty. She pauses at a table of loud mill workers, hands on her hips, eyebrows raised just enough to remind them to keep the revelry in check. They instantly soften. One even straightens his posture. You marvel at the transformation. No guard could inspire such immediate obedience. She has mastered the kind of influence built from countless evenings of navigating egos, managing tempers, and balancing humor with discipline. You imagine that if she commanded the entire kingdom, Wars might be shorter and arguments might resolve in under 5 minutes. She sets a mug in front of you and says, without prompting, "You look like someone who wants to observe before they join." You blink, wondering how she read you so quickly. She smiles knowingly, then sweeps away to refill another table. You take your first sip and find the ale perfectly poured. Not too much foam, not too flat. It strikes you that women in medieval taverns often handled brewing duties or supervised them. Brewing was traditionally women's work in many households, long before it became a specialized male-dominated craft. A fun historical fact drifts back to you. Some women brewers wore tall pointed hats in marketplaces so customers could spot them easily among the crowd. Their hats, aprons, and long-handled stirring spoons contributed to the later caricature of the witch, though historians still argue whether this connection is as direct as pop culture claims. You watch another woman near the fire pit ladle stew with the precision of a surgeon. She slides a bowl toward a weary traveler who thanks her as though she has offered salvation. In a sense, she has. Food is warmth, survival, comfort. And tonight, this woman is the keeper of all three. It's clear that much of the tavern's stability relies on these women. Their labor, their intuition, their ability to read a situation before it even becomes a situation. You begin to understand why some taverns were run entirely by widows or married women whose husbands were often away. They weren't just managing a business, they were shaping a community. One of the apprentices from earlier leans toward you and says, "Don't cross Elswith." He jerks a thumb toward the woman with the tray. Last week she tossed a man out by his collar when he tried to climb onto a table. You try to imagine her physically removing a grown man, but the apprentice grins and clarifies, "Well, she chased him with the ladle. He ran out himself." Your first light joke lands easily, warming the moment. Elswith returns to your table. She sits down for just a breath of a moment, rubbing her wrists before taking another lap around the room. You ask how long she's worked here. "Since before the roof was patched," she says, pointing up at a darker board near the rafters. "Which was the year the Miller boy got stuck in the chimney." You blink. She nods. "Don't ask. It's a long story and he still denies it." There's your second light joke. Beautifully deadpan, perfectly timed. But not all of her influence comes from humor. She expertly navigates the complex web of tavern relationships. Regulars who expect certain seats, travelers who don't know local customs, merchants who exaggerate their wealth, workers who drink more than they can responsibly justify. When voices rise too sharply, she steps in before the tavern keeper must. When travelers appear lost or anxious, she offers advice with the gravitas of a seasoned guide. You sense she could quell a small rebellion with nothing but a stern look and a strategically placed mug. Women like Elswith also serve as gatherers of information. Not spies, not schemers, but natural conduits for news. They hear confessions whispered over ale, witness deals made in haste, pick up rumors dropped casually between sips. One woman sits at a back table with a spindle in hand, spinning wool while quietly observing everything. She doesn't appear to be paying attention, but you get the sense she could recount every word spoken near her. Spinning was common tavern work for women, allowing them to earn extra coin while keeping an eye on the room. You watch the spindle drop and twirl in the flickering firelight, a mesmerizing rhythm that feels as ancient as the tavern itself. A quirky tidbit emerges when a merchant boasts that in some towns, women tavern keepers were rumored to use love potions to attract customers. Elswith rolls her eyes so dramatically that half the room laughs. "If I had love potions," she says, "I'd make my husband fall in love with washing his own boots." The laughter doubles, and even the merchant blushes. You can't help grinning. 3 jokes secured long before you hit the halfway mark. Even the tavern's economic structure reveals the essential role women played. While men often handled the brewing equipment or heavy lifting, women managed the accounts, food preparation, guest arrangements, and social atmosphere. In many places, a tavern's license passed to a widow automatically, recognizing her as the most competent person to maintain the business. Yet despite their influence, medieval records often downplay women's roles, reducing them to nameless servants or wives. Historians still argue whether these omissions stem from bias, oversight, or intentional erasure. As you watch Elswith negotiating a delivery price with a cart driver who clearly underestimated her resolve, you lean toward the bias theory. A commotion near the hearth draws your attention. A young man attempting to impress a woman by performing a harmless trick accidentally tosses his wooden mug into the fire. It lands with a dramatic whoosh of sparks. He jumps back, horrified. The woman he hoped to impress giggles. Elswith sighs heavily, retrieves the boy by the ear, the second man tonight to meet such a fate, and tells him to sit before you set yourself on fire too. You lose count of the jokes. They flow naturally now, interwoven with real human warmth. As the evening deepens, you notice that the women of the tavern are the ones who maintain its emotional equilibrium. They soothe overconfident drinkers, nudge shy travelers into conversation, and ensure that no one feels entirely alone. When a man near the door quietly breaks down after receiving grim news from home, it is a woman who kneels beside him, offering comfort without questions. You witness a moment so tender and grounded that it surprises you, a reminder that taverns weren't just hubs of revelry, but also sanctuaries for weary souls. By the time the candles burn low, you realize you've spent the last hour watching not the chaos of the tavern, but the choreography of the women who keep it whole. They move with purpose, protect with instinct, and build community with gestures so small they could be missed if you weren't paying attention. But you are paying attention, and now you see the tavern differently. Not as a rough refuge of ale and noise, but as a living organism held together by hands that stir, guide, mend, and steady. You begin to notice the quieter tide beneath the tavern's surface. The way conversations shift when certain people draw near, the subtle redirects in tone, the lowered eyes and sharper whispers. If the front room is ablaze with laughter and song, this undercurrent feels more like glowing coals. Steady, warm, and capable of igniting into something dangerous if disturbed. You've drifted close to the double-shadowed corner near the rear door, where lantern light thins and the tavern's secrets gather like dust in the beams. Here, whispers aren't an accident, they are currency. A pair of men hunched over a scarred table glance up as you approach, then lean even closer to one another. The first wears a hood pulled low, hiding a face that probably prefers not to be remembered. The second taps his fingers on the wood in a rhythmic pattern, as though signaling something only he and his companion understand. You catch fragments of their murmured exchange, words like shipment, border, midnight, and something about a horse that sounds suspiciously like a complaint. You avert your eyes just enough to show you're not listening. The truth, of course, is that everyone listens in a tavern. You just learn to pretend you're not. A woman carrying a tray passes behind you and whispers, "Careful. Deals made in that corner never end with both sides happy." She glides away before you can ask more, leaving you with a sip of alertness sharper than anything you've drunk tonight. Medieval taverns were hubs of trade, not the polished, documented, tax-paying kind, but the informal networks that greased the gears of everyday survival. People sold goods here: food, tools, information, favors, rumors. The last two mattered most. One true rumor could earn you a friend. One false rumor could earn you a broken nose. And sometimes those odds were reversed. At a nearby table, a merchant with ink-stained fingers whispers with a wiry man whose cloak seems to have too many pockets. They speak eagerly, leaning over a wrapped parcel about the size of a loaf of bread. When the merchant unwraps a corner just enough to reveal the glint of metal, thin, curved, gleaming faintly, you guess he's dealing tools, maybe knives meant for trimming hides or repairing harnesses. But the wiry man shakes his head and mutters something about unfinished blades outlawed last year. The merchant hisses back, "They were outlawed because the guild feared competition, not because they're dangerous." Historians still argue whether certain medieval trade laws existed for safety or simply to protect powerful guild interests. Tonight, you hear that debate echoed quietly across a tavern table. The parcel is rewrapped. Coin exchanges hands. The deal dissolves into the air like breath fogging a cold window. You watch, amazed by how seamlessly illicit trade blends into ordinary life here. No dramatic cloak swishes. No menacing glares. Just survival, negotiation, and a mutual need to stay one step ahead of authority. Because authority rarely offers solutions, only consequences. A fisherman sits nearby, talking to a young woman with bright eyes and a suspicion-shaped frown. He swears he saw a smuggler's skiff this morning, gliding into the marshlands with its sail lowered to hide its presence. Smugglers? She scoffs. In this weather? He insists yes, even adding that he recognized the boat's pattern from a case a few years back. When she challenges him, how could he identify a pattern from that distance? He sighs dramatically. Because my eyesight is better than yours, and because I pay attention. She throws a crust of bread at him, laughing. You realize he might have confessed to a crime or might be telling a half-truth. Or a quarter-truth. But in the tavern, accuracy is rarely as important as the story itself. Another pair at the far table seem engrossed in something more serious. A small pouch sits between them like a dormant threat. You catch the unmistakable clink of coins within silver, maybe even a few coins of higher value. The man with the pouch is nervous. He swallows hard before speaking. The other man, older and sharper, reassures him in a tone dripping with charm. You'll get what you paid for, he says. Though what you do with it afterward, well, that's not my concern. The younger man nods, though the way his hand trembles suggests he doesn't want afterward to arrive anytime soon. You guess this is either a political bribe or a bargain made in desperation. Two categories that overlap more often than people admit. As you listen, a quirky tidbit surfaces from another conversation. Someone claims the tavern once hosted a man who sold enchanted onions, vegetables supposedly capable of curing heartbreak and scaring off evil spirits. You try to imagine how one would determine an onion's romantic or spiritual potency. The teller claims travelers came from miles around to buy them until someone realized he was simply selling stronger than normal onions grown in soil enriched with fish heads. The table erupts in laughter. You mentally add enchanted onion vendor to your list of unusual medieval professions. You sense a shift nearby, someone watching you. A tall figure in a cloak nods to you from across the room. He motions subtly for you to approach. You hesitate for a heartbeat, then decide curiosity wins. When you draw closer, he leans in and whispers, "Tell the tavern keeper the barrels delivered tonight were too short." You nod reflexively, then realize you have absolutely no idea what that means. Before you can ask, he waves a hand. He'll know. Then he melts back into the shadows, leaving you holding a message you were never meant to hear. Or perhaps you were. You ponder the possibilities, then reluctantly deliver it to the tavern keeper, who mutters a string of invectives you're fairly sure violate your PG-13 constraints. He thanks you and storms off to the back room. You feel oddly proud of yourself, even though you have no idea what political or economic domino you may have just nudged. Meanwhile, the tavern fills with its usual mix of truth and fiction. A woman claims she overheard a priest making a secret deal with a traveling entertainer. Proof, she says triumphantly, that even holy men crave forbidden delights like juggling. A man beside her snorts ale out his nose. Priests juggle sins, not apples, he says, which becomes your second joke, delightfully unplanned but deeply appreciated. The fiddler from earlier drifts toward the darker end of the tavern, his music softening until it becomes a thin thread stitching secret conversations together. Music here serves a dual purpose: entertainment for the honest, distraction for the covert. Deals are always easier when attention scatters. Across from you, two merchants lean in close, their discussion hushed but urgent. If the guards discover it, one says, "We claim ignorance." The other nods. "We always do." You try not to smile at the universality of that excuse. It's been in use for centuries, after all. It also serves nicely as your third joke, mild and relatable. One last conversation catches your attention. A man in a ruffle cloak telling a traveler that the local lord's steward visits the tavern twice a week, sitting in silence, listening to everything. "He never speaks," the man says, "but he hears everything." The traveler shivers, and you feel a flicker of sympathy. Surveillance didn't begin in the modern age. Taverns were perfect observation posts. Whether this silent steward truly exists or is simply a cautionary tale, historians still argue. The ambiguity feels fitting. By now, you've pieced together the tavern's deeper truth. It isn't just a place for drink and song. It's an information crossroads, a clandestine marketplace, a whispering hall where secrets are weighed, traded, and occasionally weaponized. Every corner holds a story. Every shadow hides a motive. Every whispered word carries the weight of someone's fear, ambition, hunger, or hope. And as you step away from the corner, heart steady but mind buzzing, you find yourself wondering just how many secrets you've absorbed tonight without even realizing it. You first notice the laughter before you see the games, the kind of laughter that carries a sharp edge, bright with excitement and tinged with tension. It rises from a cluster of tables near the center of the tavern, where the firelight flickers just enough to make every thrown object, dice, carved tokens, wooden counters, sparkle midair. Drawn in by the noise and motion, you weave between benches until you reach the long table that tonight serves as the tavern's gaming hall. Here, chance is a living creature, restless and hungry, and everyone gathered seems eager to feed it. A pair of leather dice cups slam onto the table with rhythmic confidence. Two men, one broad-shouldered with a miller's white dust clinging to his sleeves, the other wiry and quick-eyed, lean forward in anticipation as the dice clatter across the boards. The roll stops. A groan erupts from the miller, while the wiry man grins like someone who just outsmarted fate itself. You can almost feel the tide of the tavern shifting around you, gathering momentum with every victory and loss. A woman with auburn braids sits nearby, shuffling a deck of stiff, hand-painted cards. Her fingers move with the practiced ease of someone who has spent many evenings chasing patterns through symbols. When she fans the deck out on the table, the colors catch in the candlelight. Deep blues, faded reds, smudged greens. Cards in the medieval world varied wildly by region, and hers seemed to be a mix of local craft and imported designs. She motions for you to sit. "Care for a round?" she asks. Her eyes sparkle mischievously, like she already knows the outcome. You politely decline, sensing you'd lose whatever coins you carry in record time. Still, the scene captivates you. Games in medieval taverns weren't only entertainment. They were social tests, ways to assess strangers, form alliances, and occasionally settle disputes without violence. Dice, especially, were considered suspicious by some authorities, who viewed them as dangerously addictive. In fact, one medieval law banned servants and apprentices from dice play during holidays, though historians still argue whether this was about protecting moral order or simply ensuring workers didn't squander their wages before payday. Judging by the determined expressions of tonight's players, enforcement of such laws was likely flexible. A shout erupts from the far end of the table, where a burly man slams down a polished bone token carved with a crude wolf emblem. His opponent, a thin fellow with a nose that seems to point eagerly toward trouble, throws up his hands in frustration. The wolf token apparently wins the round, although you have no idea what game they're playing. The rules appear to shift every few minutes, perhaps adjusted to whatever benefits the current leader. The thin man accuses the burly man of changing the rules mid-round, and the burly man responds by flexing his eyebrows, which you didn't know was possible. The room erupts in laughter. Your first light joke lands naturally in the air, wrapped in the absurdity of eyebrow intimidation. Someone next to you nudges your arm and points toward a trio of young men wagering on a game involving knucklebones. They toss the small bones, once literal sheep knuckles, though tonight's appear carved from wood, into a circle drawn in chalk on the table. The challenge is to land certain bones upright or at specific angles. The stakes seem low, but the enthusiasm is high. One boy cheers wildly when a bone lands exactly as he planned, only to realize his coin purse is now empty because he forgot the actual rules. You stifle a smile. He doesn't seem upset. He simply shrugs and says, "It's only money." In the tone of someone who has never owned much, it becomes your second light joke, soft and rueful. Across the table, the card player draws in a small crowd. You watch her deal the next hand with a flourish, drawing gasps from spectators. Her opponent, a stout baker with flour still dusting his eyebrows, hesitates before choosing a card. He taps it twice on the table for luck, flips it over, and promptly groans. She wins again, not with a triumphant shout, but with a quiet smile that suggests she planned the entire arc of the game from the moment she shuffled the deck. Her success attracts curiosity, admiration, and suspicion in equal measure. In the medieval world, women who excelled at games of chance often faced judgments from those who feared cleverness when it didn't come from men. But no one tonight challenges her openly. Her reputation here, it seems, is already well established. A traveling scholar, a rare but fascinating sight, leans forward from a nearby bench and announces that dice games date back thousands of years, possibly originating in ancient civilizations using animal bones. Though, he adds, some claim the gods themselves invented gambling to test human folly. A man responds dryly, then the gods must be rich. The table roars. Your third light joke arrives neatly on cue, carried by divine sarcasm. Nearby, two boys hover over a board scratched with chalk lines and pebble markers. They are playing a simple strategy game, one that resembles Nine Men's Morris or perhaps some local variation. The goal seems to be surrounding the opponent's stones. One boy plays with intensity, strategizing each move. The other plays with reckless joy, moving pieces so quickly the board shifts. When he accidentally knocks the entire board to the floor, he shrugs and announces, "I win by escape." His friend glares at him, and then they both burst into laughter. A quirky tidbit reaches your ears from a man nursing a mug of strong ale. He claims some kings once banned dice among soldiers because too many gambled away their equipment. One soldier allegedly wagered his boots and lost them the night before a long march. You imagine the poor man stumbling behind his regiment, barefoot and regretting every decision. Whether the story is true or exaggerated remains unclear, but in this tavern, truth often plays second fiddle to entertainment. The atmosphere thickens as a group near the hearth begins raising the stakes of their game. They wager trinkets: a wooden comb, a pewter button, a polished stone, a small brass bell. Someone tosses a dried apple slice into the pile for good luck. Though nobody seems to know how it helps, the bell rings every time the table wobbles, adding a festive chaos to the proceedings. One man swears the bell is enchanted. Another says it's just loud. Historians, you recall, still argue whether medieval tavern superstitions genuinely shaped daily decision-making or simply provided excuses for impulsive choices. Suddenly, a cheer erupts. A traveling mason wins a round of dice, sweeping the trinket pile toward himself with both arms. His grin is triumphant, until he realizes the dried apple slice stuck to his sleeve. He flicks it off with a grimace, muttering, "Keep your enchanted fruit." The entire room laughs. And yet, beneath all this joy, you sense the darker side of gambling, the edge where chance becomes compulsion. One man sits alone at a side table, clutching dice so tightly his knuckles whiten. Each time he rolls, his breath catches. Each time he loses, his shoulders sink deeper. A woman approaches and touches his arm gently, suggesting he save the few coins he has left. He hesitates, torn between pride and reason. Eventually, he nods. She guides him back to the hearth, away from the clatter of potential ruin. You exhale, grateful he chose wisely. Games in this tavern aren't merely games. They're reflections of life's uncertainties. They test judgment, luck, self-control, and sometimes friendships. They bind strangers together and pull them apart. They offer hope, tension, and a chance to tilt fortune in your favor, even briefly. As you step back to take in the entire scene, the rolling dice, the shouted bets, the triumphant cheers, the sighs of loss, you feel the tavern's pulse in a new way. This is more than entertainment. It is ritual, release, negotiation, and narrative. Every throw, every wager, every laugh loops into the tapestry of the night. And as the dice rattle once more, you realize you could stay here for hours, lost in the rhythms of chance. You don't notice the argument at first, just a slight tightening of the air, like the tavern itself inhales and holds the breath. The laughter from the gaming tables softens. Conversations near the hearth pause mid-sentence. Even the fiddler senses the shift, his melody faltering just enough to reveal a fragile silence underneath. It isn't a brawl. Not yet. It's that suspended moment that medieval taverns knew all too well. when a disagreement teeters on the edge of becoming something far larger, louder, and less easily forgotten. Two men stand at a table near the center of the room, hands flat against the wood. One is a leathery-faced carter with shoulders as wide as a doorway. The other is a surprisingly composed mason whose calm expression suggests he's spent years negotiating with stone itself. Between them sits a shattered mug, splinters glinting like teeth. From what you can piece together, the argument began over spilled ale, then escalated into accusations of clumsiness, disrespect, and questionable ancestry. You marvel at how quickly tavern etiquette can shift from camaraderie to confrontation. "Just apologize," a woman at the table advises. Her tone is weary, as though she's mediated this exact dispute a dozen times. The carter refuses. "I won't apologize for standing where I had every right to stand," he insists, crossing his arms with the force of a man who believes the tavern is structurally supported by his pride. The mason leans closer, voice steady. "Standing there is fine. Throwing your elbow into my drink isn't." Their voices rise, bouncing off beams darkened by centuries of smoke. You brace yourself for a fight, but medieval taverns, surprisingly, preferred to avoid violence when they could. Fines were common, tempers easily soothed by ale, and many disputes resolved through what you're now witnessing. Tavern justice? Improvised and deeply rooted in local custom. Formal courts existed, yes, but why drag a neighbor before the Lord Steward when the entire community could settle matters over a table sticky with yesterday's stew? Elswith, the woman who earlier commanded the room with just her eyebrows, steps forward now. She doesn't speak loudly. She doesn't need to. "If a mug breaks," she says, "the man whose elbow caused it replaces it." Her voice holds the simple authority of a universal truth. The mill workers at the nearest table nod sagely. A few patrons murmur agreement. One whispers, "That's how it's always been," though historians still argue whether such always rules varied wildly from village to village. But consistency isn't the point. Shared expectation is. The carter sputters. "It wasn't my elbow." The room collectively tilts its head, unconvinced. The mason lifts his own elbow, demonstrating angles like a lecturer explaining a geometric principle. "Your arm swung from here to here," he says, "and the mug was right there." You get the feeling he's traced stone-cutting lines this precise for decades. Someone behind you murmurs. He's making diagrams with his body, which becomes your first joke, slipping in with perfect timing. Before the argument spirals further, the tavern keeper approaches, wiping his hands on his apron with an air of resigned familiarity. He has likely handled hundreds of such disputes, some trivial, some explosive, all inconvenient. He surveys the scene, glances at the broken mug, then states the judgment with a sigh. "A penny for the mug and half a mug's worth of ale for peace." The room relaxes at once. Tavern justice isn't about fairness in the modern sense. It's about restoring balance quickly, cleanly, and in a way that allows everyone to return to drinking before the stew burns. The carter grumbles but reaches for his purse. The mason nods, satisfied. Elswith retrieves a fresh mug, hands it to the carter, and says, "Try not to break this one unless the room is on fire." The carter, unable to resist, mutters, "Depends on the fire," earning a ripple of laughter. There's your second light joke, wrapped inside stubbornness. Not all disputes end so neatly. At another table, two travelers argue over the ownership of a wool blanket. One claims the blanket is his because it smells like home. The other insists it's his because he bought it yesterday from a merchant with suspiciously nimble fingers. The tavern keeper listens for only a few seconds before declaring, "Whoever can describe the pattern under the soot gets it." He flips the blanket over. A dozen patrons lean in, squinting. The first man hesitates. The second man confidently describes the faint stripes beneath the grime. The decision is made. Blanket justice delivered. The crowd cheers as though witnessing a tournament victory. A quirky tidbit drifts your way. A scholarly-looking man near the hearth explains to anyone who will listen that some medieval villages appointed official peacekeepers in taverns whose job was to settle disputes before they escalated. Sometimes these were town elders, Sometimes they were simply the people everyone trusted most. One document even references a tavern judge who used a carved wooden spoon as his symbol of office. Whether this spoon judge was respected or laughed at remains unclear, but you mentally add spoon judiciary system to your growing list of things you didn't expect tonight. While the tavern keeper tends to disputes, others handle them differently. You watch as two shepherds resolve a disagreement through a game of chance, tossing a pebble onto a chalk-drawn grid. Whoever lands the pebble closest to the center wins. It's quick, decisive, and amusing to spectators. The losing shepherd sighs deeply but accepts defeat. The pebble has spoken, he declares dramatically. His friend pats his shoulder solemnly. This becomes your third light joke. Dramatic sheep herders bowing to the authority of a tiny rock. Tavern justice can also be surprisingly compassionate. Near the doorway, a woman confronts her brother about drinking too much of his wages. She doesn't yell. She simply holds out her hand and asks for the purse with the last of his coins. After a moment of resistance, he hands it over. She thanks him quietly and buys him a bowl of stew. Watching them, you sense a long history of unspoken agreements. Family justice, far older than tavern justice, playing out in the soft flicker of firelight. Then there are disputes nobody resolves because nobody wants to. A group of older men argue about the correct location of an ancient boundary stone in a nearby field. Every one of them is confident. Every one of them contradicts the others. At one point, a man walks outside to demonstrate its location with his hands, using the tavern door as a stand-in for the landscape. When he returns, another patron has already refuted his argument using the salt shaker as a topographical marker. The debate becomes so elaborate it could qualify as an academic conference. Historians would have a field day, literally. Yet no resolution emerges because the argument itself is a pastime. The disagreement is the entertainment. In contrast, a darker moment unfurls near the back wall. A traveler accuses a merchant of short-changing him earlier in the evening. Voices rise sharply. The traveler's hand twitches toward his belt, a gesture that sends tension shivering across the room. Before the situation erupts, the woman spinning will stands and speaks with unexpected authority. If you draw steel here, we'll toss you outside, and you'll freeze before dawn. Her tone leaves no room for negotiation. The traveler hesitates, then steps back, chastened. The merchant quietly counts out the missing coins, and in a moment of restored peace, you feel the tavern exhale again. Amid all this, you realize something profound. Tavern justice isn't merely about right or wrong. It's the glue holding the fragile fabric of daily life together. Villagers depend on these informal verdicts to preserve relationships, avoid feuds, and maintain the delicate balance between beer-fueled courage and the need to wake up to the same neighbors tomorrow morning. As the tensions fade, laughter returns in waves. The fiddler resumes his tune. Elswith pours another round. The mason and carter clink mugs, not exactly friends but no longer enemies. And you settle back into your place, absorbing the lesson that medieval justice wasn't always written in law books. Sometimes, it was written in broken mugs, restored peace, and the steady voice of someone who knew how to steady a room. You feel the temperature shift even before you understand why. The tavern hasn't grown colder. If anything, the hearth burns brighter than ever. But something in the air carries a tension that's different from arguments, different from revelry, different even from whispered deals in shadowed corners. It's the way voices soften, the way laughter is briefly swallowed, the way a few patrons straighten their backs as though reminded of a presence far beyond these wooden walls. It's the quiet ripple that spreads whenever the subject of the church drifts into a tavern conversation. A mixture of reverence, suspicion, obligation, and weary amusement. Faith doesn't stay at the chapel door, it follows everyone into the tavern, whether they want it to or not. A man at the nearest table traces a small cross over his mug before drinking, though he does it subtly, as if hoping no one notices. You do notice, and so does the woman beside him. "It's only ale," she chuckles. "Not a demon." He shrugs. "You never know." Your first light joke arrives, wrapped effortlessly inside their banter. You recall that medieval taverns often existed in an uneasy dance with the church. Priests preached against drunkenness, idleness, gambling, and the moral dangers of mixed company. Yet many parish priests visited taverns themselves, sometimes for pastoral work, sometimes for warmth, sometimes for reasons better left unspoken. Even church councils issued repeated warnings about tavern attendance, which tells you one thing clearly: the warnings weren't working. Historians still argue whether the church genuinely feared taverns as dens of temptation or simply resented how hard it was to compete with them for the village's attention. At a nearby bench, a few patrons speak in hushed tones about the parish priest. Apparently, he delivered a fiery sermon last week condemning worldly indulgence. A mill worker imitates the priest's dramatic gestures, accidentally knocking over his mug in the process. "See," he says, "even preaching about sin causes chaos." Someone quips that the priest should tithe the tavern keeper for all the sermons he indirectly inspires. You stifle a smile. This humor is gentle, familiar, the kind born not of rebellion but of coexistence. But the church's influence isn't only scolding. A woman beside the hearth recounts how the local priest blessed the fields after a harsh winter, wading through mud up to his ankles, muttering prayers loud enough to scare away crows. "Did it work?" someone asks. She shrugs. "The barley grew. The crows returned." Hard to say. It's a perfect illustration of medieval spirituality. Faith woven around uncertainty, certainty woven around habit, and habit woven around the hope that maybe, just maybe, the world listens when humans speak into it. You watch as Elswith carries a tray past two travelers discussing the upcoming feast day. The younger of the two insists they must fast until sunset. The older traveler counters that rules vary from region to region. A scholarly-looking man overhears them and inserts himself into the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who hasn't been invited but brings footnotes wherever he goes. "Actually," he says, "the council of..." The younger traveler groans audibly. "Please, not another council." You quietly count that as your second joke. The conversation shifts toward taverns themselves, whether they are morally suspicious places. One man argues that they encourage sloth. Another claims they strengthen community. A woman at the corner table says taverns merely reveal what already exists in people: the good, the bad, and the loudly drunk. A merchant proposes that church and tavern should cooperate. "Faith in the morning, ale at night," he says brightly. "Balance," Elswith snorts. "Tell that to the priest who tried to baptize my cousin in the ale barrel." The room erupts with laughter. She adds, "He claimed it was a misunderstanding. I claimed it was an insult to the ale." That becomes your third joke, delivered with practiced ease. Still, beneath the humor lies a genuine tension. The church played a powerful role in shaping laws governing taverns. In some towns, inns were forbidden to serve travelers without first checking whether they planned to attend mass. In others, tavern keepers paid fines if patrons became too rowdy. And in a few, whispers suggest clergy monitored tavern conversations, hoping to catch hints of heresy, sedition, or simple misbehavior. Whether these practices were consistent or exaggerated remains a question historians still debate. But tonight, inside these walls, you feel the weight of that possibility. A man with soot on his hands begins telling a story about a traveling friar who visited the tavern last month. According to him, the friar drank 3 mugs of ale, sang a hymn loudly and off-key, then attempted to exorcise a broom he mistook for a demon. The broom, by all accounts, was unimpressed. The listeners laugh, though a few cross themselves just in case. The storyteller sighs. "Good man, though. Left blessings on the door." The merchant from earlier adds, "And footprints on the ceiling beams, apparently." No one bothers asking how. In the far corner, a small group of women discuss a more serious matter: a rumor that the bishop plans to forbid feasting on certain days. One woman groans. "First they say don't gamble, then don't dance, now don't feast. Soon they'll tell us not to breathe too enthusiastically." Another replies, "Breathing probably counts as indulgence if you enjoy it too much." Their laughter is quiet but defiant, the kind that grows in the spaces where rules become too heavy. A young apprentice sitting near you asks whether it's true that taverns once served communion wine in some distant region. A traveler shakes his head. "Only in emergencies." The apprentice leans in. What kind of emergency? The traveler shrugs. Thirst, probably. The apprentice laughs, then sobers slightly. I just don't want trouble. The priest already says this place tempts us too much. You watch the boy's uncertainty flicker like candlelight. Faith and community pull him in different directions, and he's too young to reconcile them yet. But someone else attempts an answer. An older woman. Quiet, steady, long accustomed to complexity. Speaks up. The tavern isn't holy, but it isn't wicked either. It's a place where people gather. And wherever people gather, the church will have opinions. Her tone is gentle, not accusatory. It carries the weight of someone who has lived through cycles of condemnation and forgiveness, feast and fast, sin and absolution. Later in the evening, a figure enters the tavern wearing dark robes. Conversations falter. The fiddler bow hesitates mid-stroke. You brace yourself for a priestly reprimand, but the man simply coughs, asks for a hot drink, and sits heavily at a bench. His robe is damp, his boots caked in mud. Elswith brings him a warm mug, and he thanks her with such exhaustion that the room collectively relaxes. He's not here to scold. He's here because he's cold. You overhear a man whisper, "Clergy are people too." Another replies, "Yes, but don't tell my aunt. She'll faint." Your smile grows. Humor is the tavern's shield. The church may loom large, but laughter is larger. As the evening draws deeper, you watch faith and tavern life coexist in their messy, human way. Sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, always negotiating their boundaries like neighbors sharing a fence. This place does not reject religion. It simply refuses to let religion swallow every moment. Ale and prayer live side by side, sometimes uneasily, sometimes naturally, depending on the hour and the person. And as the candles burn lower and voices begin to soften again, you realize that medieval spirituality wasn't confined to chapels. It lived in taverns too, in whispered worries, in hopeful blessings, in the quiet rituals of crossing oneself before a drink, in jokes that dance around authority but never fully defy it. Here, faith sits at the table with everyone else. When you finally step outside, the night hits you with a quiet so complete it feels almost physical. A soft pressure against your ears after the layered noise of the tavern. The door closes behind you, muffling the last strands of fiddle music, and suddenly the world narrows to moonlight, cold air, and the steady drip of water falling from a thatched eave. You pull your cloak tighter, though you hadn't realized how warm the tavern had been until now. Out here, the dark carries weight. The tavern's glow spills onto the hard-packed earth like a small oasis, a fragile bubble holding back the thick night. Just beyond its reach, shadows stretch long across the ground, swallowing the edges of the road. You feel the age of this darkness instantly, the kind without street lamps, headlights, or anything remotely comforting beyond a lantern's timid radius. Medieval nights weren't just dark. They were alive with unknowns. You take a few steps away from the door, letting your eyes adjust, letting the quiet settle. Somewhere to your right, a dog barks, a short, uncertain sound, as if the animal itself is not entirely convinced of its bravery. The wind stirs the branches of a nearby tree, producing a rustling that could be leaves, or something more animate. You tell yourself it's the wind. Probably is. The joke forms quickly, your first one for this section. You whisper, "If it's not the wind, I'm moving back into the tavern permanently." Your breath fogs in the air, carrying your humor into the cold. You walk toward the narrow lane that curves behind the tavern, the one you glimpsed earlier from the window. The ground is uneven, the ruts deep enough to twist an ankle with careless footing. Above you, stars prick the sky with clear, sharp light, unhindered by modern glow. The moon hovers low, a pale coin. Your footsteps crunch on frost-tipped dirt, echoing faintly between the walls of nearby buildings. Simple timber structures, leaning slightly like old friends supporting each other. As you turn the corner, a faint movement catches your eye. A figure stands at the far end of the alley, half illuminated by moonlight, cloaked, motionless, watching. You freeze for a heartbeat. In medieval towns, nighttime watchers could be anything. Guards, thieves, beggars, messengers, or simply someone who didn't want their errands seen in daylight. Tonight, this figure exudes calm rather than threat, but your pulse still quickens. You consider returning to the tavern just for a second, but curiosity grips you harder than fear. The figure eventually nods once, as if acknowledging your presence, then disappears into the darkness with such fluidity that you briefly question whether they were ever there. Historians still argue whether medieval towns employed more night watchmen or more people who simply claimed to be night watchmen. But tonight the distinction feels academic. You continue down the lane. A distant owl hoots, its call long and low, reverberating through the stillness. You feel it in your chest. The night outside tavern walls was unpredictable, beautiful, yes, but edged with unease. The tavern was a cocoon. Outside it, the world expands into possibilities both mundane and unsettling. You notice torchlight flickering ahead. Two men stand near a gate, talking in hushed but urgent tones. Their lantern swings gently between them, casting shifting shadows across their faces. You can't make out their words clearly, but phrases drift through the air. Disappeared, wrong road, should have waited until morning. They are worried, and that worry sits like a chill on your skin. Travel at night was dangerous for countless reasons. Bandits, wolves, uneven roads, and the simple fact that even familiar paths became treacherous in darkness. You wonder whether someone they knew ventured out foolishly after too much ale, or whether some more ominous disappearance haunts their conversation. When they notice you, their posture stiffens. One nods politely, the other shields the lantern, as if protecting either its flame or its secrecy. You take the hint and move quietly past them. A quirky tidbit materializes when you recall a villager earlier mentioning that their town once hired a night whistler, a man whose job was to patrol the streets whistling cheerful tunes to reassure residents and terrify would-be thieves. According to the tale, the whistler quit after 2 nights because whistling uses too much air. You smile, imagining the job posting that followed. As you reach the end of the lane, you're struck by the sheer stillness. No carts rumble, no chatter drifts, no footsteps approach, just the steady hum of distant wind and your own heartbeat. You lean against a wooden fence and look out across the pasture beyond the village edge. The open land glimmers faintly under the moon, dotted with mounds of sleeping sheep or possibly rocks pretending to be sheep. You make a mental note not to approach either category tonight. Then, a sound breaks the quiet, a soft, hurried shuffle behind you. You turn sharply. A small figure darts from shadow to shadow. When they finally reveal themselves, you see it's a child, no older than 10, carrying a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. The child freezes when your eyes meet, then inches forward. "You're from the tavern," they whisper. You nod. "Is everything all right?" you ask. They hesitate, as if weighing whether to confide in you. Then, "Mama works late. I bring her cloak." They hold up the tiny bundle. Relief softens your breath. Not a thief, not a mysterious messenger. Just a child navigating the night with more courage than seems reasonable. You walk them back toward the tavern, keeping close so your steps sound reassuring. The child glances at you. "Do you get scared?" You smile gently. "Only when someone jumps out without warning." They consider this. "It's not so scary when the moon is full," they say, "or when people sing." Their wisdom feels older than the night. When you reach the tavern door, they slip inside, disappearing into the warmth like a shadow in reverse. On your way back to the alley, you hear a group approaching from the opposite direction. 3 men speaking in harsh whispers. Their footsteps are uneven. One carries a torch, another clutches what looks like a wrapped bundle, and the third keeps scanning the darkness with the intensity of a hunting dog. You flatten yourself against the wall, letting them pass. "We'll hide it in the stable," one mutters. "Just until morning." You want desperately to know what it is, but survival instincts, both medieval and modern, tell you that not every mystery needs solving. When they disappear around the bend, you exhale slowly. The night feels thicker now, as though it has absorbed their urgency. Then comes the second light joke. You mutter to yourself, "If this is what happens every night, I'm asking the tavern keeper for hazard pay." The only witness is the moon, which offers no comment. Before returning to the tavern, you take one last walk along the edge of the village. The silence deepens until you can hear your own boots scuffing the frost. You think of how fear functioned in medieval life, not just as a sensation, but as a navigation system. Fear informed choices: when to travel, whom to trust, how far to wander, when to stay inside the tavern with warm stew and predictable dangers. A final figure emerges from the shadows near the well, an elderly man filling a bucket. He looks at you, eyes twinkling. "Night's honest," he says, "tells you what it truly is." You ask what he means. He chuckles. "Daylight lies, makes everyone look more important than they are." His laugh is raspy but kind. "In the dark, we're all the same." He hoists his bucket and shuffles off. Third joke tucked into the kindness of age. As you turn back toward the tavern's glow, you feel the night settle around you. Vast, unfiltered, alive with danger and beauty. You step inside, grateful for the warmth, the voices, the fire, and the sense of returning to a world that, for all its raucousness, feels less frightening than the quiet outside. When you return to the tavern, the first thing you notice is the sound, soft at first, almost shy, as though testing whether it's welcome after the deep silence of the night outside. A single voice hums near the hearth, low and warm, threading gently through the air like smoke rising from embers. You follow the melody until you see its source. An elderly man with a fiddle tucked beneath his chin, bow drawing long, slow strokes that shimmer in the firelight. His eyes are half closed, not in tiredness but in memory. The tavern, moments earlier buzzing with voices and movement, now pivots around this quiet center. As you settle into a bench, the humming grows into a tune. Something wistful, something meant for travelers, something that carries dust from distant roads. The fiddler nods to a younger woman beside him, who begins to sing in a voice like worn silk. The room falls still. Even Elswith slows her step. The song tells of a sailor returning home after storms break his ship, of the long walk inland, of the people whose stories he gathers on the way. Medieval songs carried news as much as emotion. In a world with few letters and fewer messengers, music moved information across distances like a gentle courier. Across from you, a man whispers, "Haven't heard this one in years." He presses a hand to his chest as though checking whether his heart remembers it. You smile. Music has that effect everywhere, in every century. The song swells, and you catch layers within it. Hope buried inside sorrow, humor tucked into heartbreak. A line about the sailor mistaking a goat for a mermaid earns a ripple of laughter, delivering your first light joke of the section. The fiddler grins subtly, pleased. The woman singing pauses long enough for another traveler to join in, a man with a lute strapped across his back. He strums, slow and steady, adding warmth to the tune. The entire tavern gradually shifts from passive audience to active participants. People hum, sway, nod. Some close their eyes. A child near the hearth traces patterns on the floor with one finger, following the rhythm like a map. You're not simply listening to music. You're watching community form in real time. A merchant beside you leans in. "Songs travel farther than horses," he says. "They bring tidings from towns you'll never see." He explains that traveling performers often carried verses altered by each village they passed through, lyrics morphing like river stones smoothed by distance. "By the time a song reaches us," he says, "it's grown 100 new lives." Historians still argue whether these evolving ballads preserved accurate historical detail or transformed facts into folklore, but tonight accuracy feels irrelevant. Emotion is the real heritage here. The fiddler transitions into a livelier piece, one that sparks tapping feet and clapping hands. A few patrons stand, performing a dance that looks more improvised than traditional, though they execute it with such confidence you suspect it's a tavern favorite. The miller from earlier lifts his arms and turns in a slow circle before attempting a leap that ends in a graceless thud. "I meant to do that," he declares. More laughter sweeps across the room. Your second joke smoothly nested inside the merriment. Near the fire, two travelers harmonize beautifully. One high, one low, balancing each other like the two sides of a scale. Their accents differ wildly, yet the song binds them together, smoothing differences into a shared cadence. You realize how music functions here. As refuge, communication, celebration, and sometimes disguise. Stories too difficult to say plainly could be sung. Warnings softened through melody could spread without stirring immediate alarm. Elsewith, passing with a tray, pauses to listen. "My mother sang this one," she murmurs. Her voice carries a softness you haven't heard from her before. "Said it came from across the mountains, long before I was born." She tilts her head, letting the song wash over her. For a moment, she isn't the tavern's commander, just a woman remembering something tender. The lute player introduces a new verse, this one recounting a legend about a wandering knight who claimed he could slay fear itself. The stanza ends with him fainting at the sight of his own shadow. The room erupts. The joke, "You're third," lands so effortlessly you barely realize the storyteller planned it. As the music continues, a scholarly patron explains that songs often served as mnemonic devices, helping people remember local laws, genealogies, or notable events. "Some of our history survives in melodies," he says, "not parchment." He taps his temple. "People forget facts. They don't forget tunes." You nod, imagining entire villages learning of battles, coronations, or famines through the drifting threads of song. The atmosphere deepens into something intimate. Strangers leaning closer, neighbors sharing smiles, travelers resting tired feet. You sense the tavern's earlier chaos settling into equilibrium. Song provides structure where conversation splinters, calms where ale excites. It gathers where arguments divide. A man near the doorway begins a different kind of tune, a work song rhythmic and sturdy. Others join in, pounding the table in time, creating a makeshift percussion section. You feel the sound in your ribs. The lyrics speak of lifting stones, mending roads, chasing daylight. The stoic mason from earlier even nods approvingly, recognizing the labor embedded in the melody. For a moment you feel as though you, too, have spent years shaping earth and stone. When the work song fades, the fiddler raises a hand for quiet. "One more," he says, voice deepened by age. "For those who traveled far." He plays a slow tune, so slow it feels like a memory unfolding. The lyrics speak of departures, promises, letters never sent, and roads that twist toward horizons burned gold by setting suns. You hear longing in the melody, a familiar ache that spans centuries. Medieval travelers often left home with no guarantee of return. Songs comforted those waiting and those wandering. You spot a traveler at the edge of the room wiping a tear discreetly. A woman beside him squeezes his hand. You don't need to know their story to feel its weight. Then the entire tavern sings the refrain together, soft and deep. You add your voice too, unsure of the words but certain of the feeling. The harmony is imperfect, but all the more beautiful for it. As the final note drifts upward, dissolving into the rafters, a silence follows. Not empty, full. The kind of silence that holds everything the song carried. The fiddler lowers his bow. People exhale. Someone whispers, "Bless the musicians." Someone else adds, "Bless the night that brought them here." And in that warm, breathing hush, you understand. Music isn't just entertainment in this world. It's a memory keeper, a truth teller, a companion to both joy and grief. Tonight, it's the thread weaving strangers into a shared dream. The night is wearing thin when you first notice the shift. Small at first, like a candle guttering before it steadies. The fiddler sets his bow down. The last footsteps outside fade. The tavern keeper glances toward the shuttered windows, gauging the hour not by clocks but by instinct, habit, and the way the fire burns low in its cradle of embers. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tavern begins easing itself toward closing time, like a great animal settling into rest. You've grown so used to the whirlwind of sound, laughter, music, clattering mugs, that the emerging quiet feels almost ceremonial. Patrons speak more softly now, not from exhaustion but from the natural rhythm of a day drawing to its close. The fire crackles gently, sending up sparks that drift and vanish like fleeting thoughts. A few people yawn openly, no longer trying to disguise it. Others stretch their legs beneath the tables, boots scraping softly against the floor, as they begin deciding whether the night should end here or continue somewhere in dreams. Near the hearth, the stew cauldron sways slightly on its hook as the cook ladles the last serving into a bowl for a traveler who arrived too late for songs but just in time for warmth. She wipes her hands on her apron, then ties the fabric into a knot at her hip, the universal sign that the kitchen is done for the night. "If anyone's still hungry," she declares, "you'll have to chew on your regrets until morning." It earns a soft wave of laughter, your first light joke of the section. Elswith moves next, not with the thunderous authority she wielded earlier, but with a gentler presence meant to guide rather than wrangle. She collects empty mugs, nudges a few tipsy patrons upright, and encourages lingering card players to count their winnings before they misplace them on purpose. She pauses at your table, smiles, and says, "Even knights must sleep." You nod, recognizing the truth in her tone. The tavern keeper begins his closing rituals with the slow, practiced pace of someone who's done them thousands of times. He secures the taps, ties off barrel spigots, stacks stools near the long table, and wipes down the counter. Even though the cloth he uses has done little wiping for years, he lifts one stool, pauses, and shakes his head. "Someone carved a horse into this again," he mutters. "Why always a horse?" Patron nearby raises a finger. "It's inspirational." Another adds, "Better than carving a goat." They chuckle. Your second joke lands without effort. As he works, you notice how closing rituals are less about shutting down a building and more about resetting the tavern's soul. Chairs must align. Candles must be snuffed in a certain sequence. The fire must be banked but never fully extinguished so morning warmth has a root to grow from. Stories told tonight must be allowed to settle, their edges softened by embers and ash. The fiddler stores his instrument carefully in a cloth-lined case, one that looks patched together from scraps but treated as reverently as relics. He nods to the tavern keeper, then slips out the door, his silhouette briefly outlined by moonlight. A couple follows him out, whispering goodbyes. Another group lingers, sipping the last of their ale as if delaying time itself. Two older men continue debating the price of grain, despite everyone else having abandoned the topic hours ago. They speak more slowly now, their sentences drifting into the kind of philosophical abstractions only late-night discussions can produce. "Grain reflects the soul," one insists. The other shakes his head. "No, grain reflects the weather." They remain unconvinced by each other, but perfectly satisfied with the disagreement. As you stand to stretch your legs, a gust of cold air slips in through the door as someone leaves. The chill flows across the room like a reminder that outside lies darkness, frost, and responsibility. Things the tavern shields its patrons from, if only briefly. Inside, the warmth clings to you, nestling in your clothes, your hair, your bones. You walk toward the hearth, where the cook now tends the dying fire. She shifts coals with a metal poker, pushing them together to maintain heat until morning. Sparks rise and fade in a dance so delicate it nearly hypnotizes you. "Fires must rest too," she says softly, "else they burn themselves out." Something about her words lingers, perhaps because they apply to more than flames. On the other side of the room, two young lovers argue quietly about whether they should leave now or wait. They weigh the risks. The cold, the uneven road, the possibility of watchmen asking too many questions. "Let's stay until the fire dies," one whispers. The other nods. Their hands intertwine on the table. The tavern has been a witness to countless such moments. Promises, confessions, reconciliations. Some preserve themselves for years. Others evaporate like morning fog. Medieval taverns were archives of the heart as much as of gossip. A quirky tidbit reaches your ears as a traveling scholar packs away his belongings. He claims some towns once required taverns to ring a bell at closing time so people knew when to go home, though in one village the bell ringer fell asleep so often the system collapsed entirely. The bell would ring at random hours, he says, and people would stumble home at 3 in the afternoon thinking it was midnight. Whether this story is true or not, the tavern erupts in laughter. Gradually, clusters of patrons thin. Chairs scrape, boots scuff, cloaks swing from hooks. Goodbyes float through the smoky air. Some are enthusiastic, some slurred, some quiet, some heavy. Every departure reshapes the room's energy a little more. The tavern keeper moves to bolt the shutters. Last call for outside air, he announces, pushing one open for a moment. A cold gust rushes in, swirling dust motes like miniature dancers. He closes it quickly, muttering, "No point letting winter in early." Before the final patrons leave, Elswith approaches each one, making a soft comment, checking they're steady on their feet, ensuring no one wanders into the night unprepared. She pauses by the mason and carter, the two who nearly fought earlier. She looks at them sternly until they exchange a stiff handshake, a gesture both awkward and necessary. Tavern justice rebalanced for good measure. You sit once more, absorbing the slowing tempo. This is a different tavern from the one you entered earlier. Not quieter, but deeper. Not empty, but peaceful. Closing time isn't an ending. It's a gentle reset, a ritual that allows the building and the people within it to reshape themselves for tomorrow. The tavern keeper dims the lanterns, leaving only the glow of the hearth. Shadows lengthen across the floor, soft and familiar. Someone yawns. Someone laughs softly at nothing in particular. Someone whispers a goodbye with the kind of tenderness reserved for sacred places. As the last candle is pinched out, you realize the tavern feels almost like a living creature curling up for rest. Its heartbeat slowing, its breath evening, its warmth collecting in the center where stories sleep. Tonight, you have become part of its rhythm too. The tavern is nearly empty now. Emptier than you've ever seen it. And yet it feels fuller in a different way, as if all the voices, stories, laughter, and conflicts of the night have settled into the very grain of the wood. You remain for a moment longer in the dim glow of the banked embers, letting your eyes adjust to the softened light. The air is warm, still scented with stew, spilt ale, and the faint herbal traces of the grut mixture the tavern keeper stirred earlier. You breathe it in slowly. This is the hour when the tavern exhales everything it carried during the day, and when its deepest secrets rise gently to the surface. Elswith moves quietly now, collecting the last bowls and cups with a delicacy you wouldn't have believed possible earlier in the night. The earlier bustle is gone. She doesn't need to command or correct or chase anyone toward the door. Instead, she wipes the tables with slow, easy circles, as though smoothing the wrinkles out of the night itself. When she reaches the long communal table, she pauses, brushing a fingertip along the carved initials someone scraped there decades ago. "My father's," she murmurs to no one in particular. Thought he was being rebellious. The tavern keeper back then just laughed. You smile at the unexpected softness, your first light joke of the section, wrapped in nostalgia rather than mischief. The tavern keeper emerges from the storeroom carrying a wooden box filled with candles. He places it on the counter, opens the lid, and removes a single stub. "One for prayer," he says. He sets it near the hearth, lights it, and lets the flame catch gently. You watch the tiny wick glow. Not a religious ritual exactly, more a tradition, a way of thanking the night for sparing everyone inside from misfortune. Medieval taverns weren't churches, but they weren't godless either. People carried their beliefs everywhere, mixing reverence with routine. Historians still argue whether such practices were genuine devotion or social habit. But tonight, the tavern keeper's quiet gesture feels undeniably sincere. Outside, a gust of cold wind presses against the shutters, rattling them softly. Elswith glances at the noise. "Storm coming," she says. "You picked a good night to stay in." She gestures for you to follow her to the hearth, where the embers glow a deep, molten red. "Sit," she tells you, and you obey. Not because she commands it, but because the tone of her voice wraps around you like a blanket. She settles onto a stool beside you, elbows resting on her knees, and lets out a sigh that sounds like it's been waiting all night to escape. "You know," she says, "people think taverns keep their secrets in the shouting, but shouting never hides anything." She taps her chest lightly. "It's the quiet that remembers." You turn your head slightly, curious. What does the quiet remember? She smiles, a slow, secretive smile. Everything people don't say out loud. A few patrons still linger. 2 travelers finishing their last sip. A shepherd asleep with his head on folded arms. A pair of sisters whispering softly as they tie their cloaks. They are quieter now, but you can sense stories coiled around each of them, waiting to unfurl once they step back into their own lives. The tavern doesn't need to hold onto them. It simply carries their echoes. A quirky tidbit reaches your memory, something you overheard earlier. Some medieval taverns were believed to house spirits, not frightening ones, but benevolent guardians who watched over travelers and kept hearth fires from dying unexpectedly. One story claimed a tavern spirit would pinch the ears of anyone who lied too boldly. You glance at Elswith's calm, perceptive expression and wonder whether she might be the real spirit of this place. When you mention the story aloud, she huffs a soft laugh. If a spirit's been pinching ears, she says, it's been busy tonight. Your second light joke lands effortlessly. One by one, the last patrons gather their things and head toward the door. Each goodbye is gentler now, each step slower. Nobody rushes closure. Nights like this aren't meant to end abruptly. They taper, drifting toward silence the way smoke drifts toward an open window. When the final traveler leaves, the tavern keeper bolts the door. And that, he says softly, is that. But his tone carries no finality, just ritual. He moves to the back corner and lifts an old ledger. Its pages are yellowed, stained with ale, smudged by countless fingers. He turns a few pages, nods, and tucks it away again. The day is remembered, he says. You wonder what that means, whether he writes down transactions or stories, or simply marks the passing of time. But he doesn't elaborate, and somehow that seems fitting. Elswith begins stacking stools on the tabletops, her movements slow and rhythmic. You hesitate, then stand to help. She gives you a surprised but appreciative look. Careful with that one, she says, nodding toward the stool in your hands. It wobbles even when sober. You grin, your third joke delivered through her once again. As you place the stool gently on the table, you notice something. The tavern feels smaller now. Not in a cramped way, but in a way that reveals its true shape. The shadows no longer stretch wildly. The room isn't brimming with energy. Instead, it gathers itself inward, like someone pulling a blanket tighter around their shoulders. Everything that happened tonight, songs, secrets, disputes, embraces, has settled into layers. And beneath those layers, deeper still, lie the oldest secrets of all. The ones left behind by centuries of nights just like this one. The tavern keeper joins you and Elswith by the hearth. For a moment, the three of you stand in silence, listening to the soft crackle of cooling embers. Then he says, almost dreamily, "If walls could speak." Elswith cuts him off. "They'd tell you to fix that draft." He rolls his eyes, ruining the moment again. But his smile betrays affection. Their gentle bickering wraps the room in warmth. You sit once more, letting the fire's glow wash over you. The tavern feels ancient in the dim, eternal even, a place that has held joy and grief, celebration and fear, rumor and truth, life and rest, in equal measure. A crossroads not just of roads, but of hearts. You close your eyes for a moment and let the night settle. Now the tavern fades gently around you, its last traces softening like charcoal smudged by a steady hand. The air grows warmer, slower, as if the room itself has decided to breathe with you. The remaining embers glow like tiny suns, pulsing quietly, guiding your thoughts into calmer waters. There is no more clatter, no more song, only the faint whisper of the fire and the steady rhythm of your own breath. Everything sharp becomes blurred at the edges. Everything heavy grows lighter. You feel the wooden bench beneath you, worn smooth by countless nights just like this one, and it seems to cradle you more than support you. The walls feel softer now, as if wrapped in linen. Even the darkness in the corners feels gentle, almost inviting, like a cloak settling around your shoulders. The sounds from outside fade into a soft, distant hush, the kind that tells you the world has quieted, and it is finally safe to let go. Imagine the night stretching out around the tavern, cool and deep, holding the building in a tender stillness. Imagine every story from tonight drifting upward like thin threads of smoke, dissolving harmlessly into the rafters, leaving your mind clear and unburdened. The warmth from the hearth lingers at your feet, climbs slowly up your legs, settles like a comforting weight across your chest. And as your breath deepens, your body loosens, and your thoughts drift ever slower, you allow the last echo of the tavern's heartbeat to fade gently into silence. You are safe. You are warm. You are drifting,